Okay, so I'm going to do a tutorial today about how to achieve flying geese in any size that you're doing without as much headache as you might have done in the past. So I have recently done a couple of different projects with flying geese recently, and there were two different sizes that we had to do. The size that I'm going to start with today first comes out to be 2.5 by 4.5. So I've pre-cut my rectangle. This is actually 2 3/4 by 4.5, and this one is it follows the cutting instructions of 2.5 by 4.5. So I'm going to show you how to make it work if you want to overcut your flying geese, like I've done for this unit with these, or cut it according to the pattern size, like I've done with this unit. So the wing units for the 2.5 by 4.5 are 2.5 by 2.5 square. So those are this is the way that the pattern called for it. These are the squares in rectangle. These are the oversized. So this is 2 3/4 by 4.5. So instead of 2.5 by 4.5, it's 2 3/4 by 4.5. So it's an extra 1/4 of an inch. And I have cut my wing squares for that unit the same. I've cut them oversized. I've cut them 2 3/4. So this is going to work the same way as a traditional flying goose unit. And what we are going to do is, I use diagonal seam tape on my machine, but I know you can't really see that on camera. So I will go ahead and draw my lines. And this is a water soluble pen. I have not tested it on this fabric. All of these are scraps that have been gifted to me to go towards my 1 inchy project. Yes, I am the crazy quilter. And so we are going to give this a try on these fabrics. So I don't know how well this is showing up on camera, but I have that one diagonal line drawn from corner to corner. And again, the units that I'm starting with first are the ones that are cut according to the pattern directions. So these are going to go with that rectangle, and I'm going to sew one on, and I will trim and press, and then I will sew the other on and trim and press. And we'll do the same thing with this one as well, the oversized. Now again, if you have diagonal seam tape and you know how to use that, you absolutely can, but for the purposes of showing it on camera, and I don't have my camera set up yet at my machine, this is going to be the best way for you to be able to see what I'm talking about. And I did choose the water soluble versus the air soluble because I don't quite know how long I'm going to take to do this tutorial, and I want the line to still be visible. I am also using a very different thread color from what my finished project thread would normally be, solely so that you guys can see that. So give me just a moment. Let me go sew. I'm going to sew one side onto each. Doesn't matter which side. I'm going to go sew the one side onto each. I will come back and show you where I'm going from here. Okay, so I am back. I have sewn both of my flying geese units, and I do apologize for the background noise. So I've sewn the first wing on each of these units, and I do want to show you. So this unit, for example, I'm not exactly on the line the entire time. I'm a little bit over, and I'm on the wrong side, but I have sewn pretty close to the line. This unit, I know the line isn't quite as visible, but I have sewn just a thread's breadth on the outside away from the unit That will be important when you want to get your correct size of Flying Goose unit. So I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to line up my thread line, not my drawn line, my thread line, with my 1/4 inch marking. And I'm going to trim this off so that can be waist, or it comes out to a 1 inch square, so that will go in my 1 inchy box. And we are going to do the same to this unit. Again, we're going to measure out the unit, measuring on your thread line, not your drawn line. So if you do go one direction or the other with your thread, you want to follow your thread because you want to make sure you have a secure seam. So I'm going to press both of these units, and I will be right back and show you how we do the second one. Okay, I have gone ahead and pressed both of my units. Now I'm a starch user, but I did not pre-starch my units before I started cutting, so I'm not starching now. I'm not going to add any extra liquid to my units. So if you remember that I've got 2 different size units, so this is the 2.5 by 4.5 that the pattern called for. This is the 2 3/4 by 4.5 that I'm making instead. So in order to make your Flying Goose unit, you want both of your wings to go up away from the center diamond, or center triangle. So you're wanting to make a triangle. So I'm going to go ahead and lay that there, and we're going to do the same thing with this one. And remember, I still have my water-soluble lines that I drew earlier. So I am going to go back to the machine, get these sewn up, and show you where we go from here. Okay, so I am back. I have sewn my 2 Flying Geese units. So I have added my extra triangles. And again, on the larger one, I'm not as concerned with making sure that I stay on one side or the other of the line. It's definitely okay to have a little bit more imperfection when you are using an oversized piece. The one that is cut to the pattern directions, however, I know the line is very faint, but I have sewn just to the outside of my drawn line. So I'm going to trim these, and we're going to do the same thing we did before. We're going to line up this sewn line with our 1/4 inch marking on our ruler and get that trimmed away. And we're going to do the same thing with our other piece. And I know the camera may not pick it up very well, but my ruler has a pink line at the 1/4 inch line markings. So that is what I'm lining up with my seam line. All right, so now all I'm going to do is I'm going to press these away, and I will be right back. Okay, I am back. I have trimmed both of my Flying Geese units. This one was made according to the pattern instructions. The cutting was done according to the pattern instructions, and this one was cut oversized. So if you look here, you can definitely see I have about a finger's width seam allowance there. So I have quite a bit of room. This one, I think I have 1/4 inch, but that's all I have. It is a very tight seam allowance. So we are going to trim these so that they match to the pattern instructions. And so these were supposed to be 2.5 by 4.5. So I am looking for my 2.5 line, and I am lining it up here. And I'm looking up here. I do not have a full 1/4 inch. So I am going to lose a little bit of my diamond or my point at the top. So one thing that I do when I run into something like this, I am okay with sewing with 1/8 inch seam allowance. It's not really ideal, but I have done it, and I will do it. I am going to go ahead and I am going to trim it to the 2.5 by 4.5, but just know that I have lost my point. So I did not maintain my point there. So I have very little waste from that side, from that trim. I'll have a little bit more from this one. And I did use a little bit of steam. I wasn't thinking about that, but I did use a little bit of steam. So the steam will have played a little bit of a role in my fabric stretching just a hair. So with the drawn line, I do not have a 1/4 inch seam allowance up here. It's very, very scant. I mean, it's right on it. I'm gonna line this up and show you close to the camera. So if you can see my 1/4 inch marking right there, my point is right on that marking, if not just a little bit above it. So when I go to sew this together, if I remember to, I will sew with like 1/8 inch so I won't lose that point. So my 1/8 inch is actually where these bottom lines are beneath the numbers. So my 1/8 inch would give me plenty of my point back, and then I can just retrim as I go. And that's if I remember to. If I don't remember to, then I've lost my point a little bit. So granted, now sewing it with the pattern directions, you see how much waste I had. It was very little, it was just a few threads here and there. But it's annoying when you lose your point, especially if you are wanting your point. So let me trim my oversized. Now remember, I trimmed this to 2 3/4, the rectangle was 2 3/4 instead of 2 1/2, so I have an extra 1/4 inch. And then each of my squares was also 2 3/4, so an extra 1/4 inch on each side of the square. So, I mean, I could keep this flying goose unit as it is right now, but let's line up that 2 1/2 inch marking with my bottom of my unit. So I've got my 2 1/2 inch marking here, and then coming up here, I do still lose my 1/4 inch, but I don't want to. So actually, I take that back. I do not lose my 1/4 inch at all. So that is one way that you can make sure that you do get your seam allowance into your quilt pieces. Now, the other problem that I just ran into, I didn't look. I have lost my 4 1/2. So this is supposed to be 4 1/2 inches wide, and my 4 1/2 is right here. So you will lose length when you just do it, when you do the oversized just one way. So I did the oversized 2 3/4 by 4 1/2, but I've lost like 1/8 inch total between the two sides. So that really would make piecing this a lot harder. So what I would recommend doing, if you want to achieve your oversize and get an easy 1/4 inch for your point and be able to still use your pieces, when you get measurements, if you need the extra room, go ahead and resize all of your pieces. Just add a 1/4 inch one direction. So this was supposed to be 2 1/2 by 4 1/2. So instead of doing 2 1/2 by 4 1/2, you would do 2 3/4 by 4 3/4. And you would still do your 2 3/4 on your squares for your wings. And that would give you plenty of room so that you have both your width and your height, and you don't lose your points on your flying geese. So I do have it done in another size, but we're gonna run into the same problem because I didn't add the extra height or the extra length. So let me grab another piece of fabric and we will cut our rectangle for our other flying geese, and we're going to test this theory. So these were supposed to be cut at 2 inches by 3 1/2. So this is oversized. It is not 2 inches. I actually cut it 2 3/4. so I way oversized it. So it doesn't really need to be that tall. But if I'm going to oversize the outside, I need to go to 3 3/4, because 2 1/2 means I need to go 2 1/2, and then I need to go by 3 1/4, or 2. Correction, I need to go 3 3/4. So this rectangle is cut per the pattern instructions. So it is 2 inches tall by 3 1/2 inches long. And then these are the squares that go with it, and they are 2 inches square. So this flying goose unit is cut the way the pattern recommended. So if they're supposed to be 2 inches square, these are 2 1/4, which is correct. So my rectangle needs to be 2 1/4 by 3 3/4. So I'm going to cut a 2 1/4 inch strip. And isn't this fabric just darling? One of my friends donated this to me. She knows I'm doing a 1-inch project. And so all of my fabric does get cut down. All my donated fabric does get cut down to 1 1/2 or 1 inch squares to finish a 1/2 inch in a quilt. And I will get around to it when I get around to it. I haven't gotten there yet. Some of the fabrics I do need now, some of them I don't need just yet. All right, so we have our 2 1/4 inches tall, and the pattern calls for 3 1/2, so we are going to go 3 3/4. So I have a little bit of an edge here that I'm going to cut off. So I want to go ahead and trim one side, and then I will flip it around and trim that extra. And if you ever wonder if a fabric doesn't suit your tastes, and you might consider it, for example, ugly or something like that, if you would use those words for a fabric, you just haven't cut it small enough. Because these fabrics, once they finish out, when I have just that 1/2 inch showing, I'll just have a swatch of color. It won't actually show a giraffe or anything juvenile, because my quilt pattern that I am planning does not have juvenile prints in it. So this will be absolutely fine. All right, so now we have our rectangle that is 2 1/4 by 3 3/4. So that is our oversized that we're going to use for our oversized test. So let's take our squares, and we are going to do the same thing as before. We are going to go ahead and draw a line across so that you can see exactly where I'm aiming. And I have been doing all this sewing standing up because I don't want to move my chair. So it is definitely a bigger challenge than before, and the diagonal seam tape is a lot harder to use. So these lines are really coming in handy. So, and I'm making sure that these lines are super, super visible on camera if I can. So you wouldn't necessarily want to draw that thick of a line, but again, I want you to be able to see it. And from what I can tell, you can see it even without me moving the camera or moving my fabric. And I did choose these fabrics out of my bin of scraps solely so that I could make sure that you could see them against my black cutting mat. I can flip this over and it's a purple one, but I've got a lot of nicks already in it, and that's my normal side. I love purple. So we are using the black on tutorials just to make sure that you can see what I'm working with. Unless I'm working with black fabric, and then we'll have to flip it over anyway. All right, so we've got our lines drawn there, and so we are going to rinse and repeat what we did earlier. So I am going to take and sew on the lines on both of my flying geese units, and I will bring them back here to trim in just a moment. Okay, so I am back. I have sewn these on, and just as before, I wasn't too concerned about my sewing line on my oversized, but on my one that I cut to the pattern size, I did attempt to sew to the side of the piece, or side of the line. That way I'm not cutting into the piece that I need. So I'm going to trim these up. And again, we are cutting just against the thread line, 1/4 inches going up against the thread line. And so on these are actually a little too small, so they will go in my scrap for animal beds. So I know a lot of people say when you do your flying geese oversized that you have a lot of waste, and it's only waste if you decide that it's going to be waste. So for example, this is 1 inchy, so I can keep that for myself. All right, so I'm going to go press these and I will be right back. Okay, so we are back and I want to show you what I have done with the pressing on these units. So the oversized unit, I've still gone ahead and pressed it out towards the wing unit, and that is just like I did on the previous units. So I did press them away from that center triangle. So that, my oversized unit, I did that as well. Get rid of that extra thread. But on this one was the one that was cut to the pattern size, which was 2 inches by 3.5. And what I've done with it is I have pressed the seam open. And I've tried this on one of my more recent projects, and it was the first time that I've pressed open. And I really had never done that before on flying geese. And amazingly enough, especially when you start joining, like let's say we were joining 2 flying geese units, at the points, having those units pressed open would make it a lot simpler to get a precise seam. So we are going to go ahead and let me pair these up, and we're going to go back with the sizes that we were going with. So this is the one cut to the pattern, and this is the one I cut oversized. So we are going to go ahead and lay those down, and we're going to go sew these. I'll be right back. Okay, so we are back, and I have sewn both of my units. So again, the oversized unit, I have sewn pretty much on the line, but at one point I'm to this side of the line, and the other point I'm to this side of the line. So, but because this is a little oversized, we have a little bit of room for that. So this is the unit that I cut according to the pattern, and this is the one I've been pressing open on this turn. So I have sewn on the right hand side, or the outside of that line. So we are going to go ahead and we are going to press both of these open, or I apologize, we are going to trim both of these. And again, we are trimming following that seam line. And I am due for a new blade. So I will be changing that after this video. Remember that if you are having trouble cutting, always try changing your blade before you think that it's the mat and you try to get rid of it. Just go ahead and change your blade to see if that makes a difference, because 9 times out of 10 it is the blade. You should not have to press hard on a rotary cutter. It is not a safe rotary cutter when you are doing that. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and press these, and I will be right back. Alright, so we are back, and I am going to show you where we are at. So I have taken both of my units, and this one was cut oversized, and this one was cut according to the pattern. This one was also pressed with all of the seams open. So if you see up here at this point, this is very, very flat. And if I starched it, which I typically do, it would be completely flat. It would be almost like paper, and it would be very, very thin. Whereas, although it looks pretty on the back having just the triangle, this gets very bulky very quickly because you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 layers of fabric that you will be sewing through when you sew this point. So we are going to see how we did on the size and see about trimming. So these were supposed to come out 2 inches by 3.5 inches. So I have got my bottom lined up with my 2-inch mark, and we are just over the 3.5, but just by a thread. It is not bad at all. So I will have a little bit of trimming. We are going to trim here, and we are going to flip it and do just a little bit of trim. I mean, it is very, very little to be trimmed. I'm going to get loose threads here, but so literally it's falling apart. It's a thread or two. That's literally all I had to trim off. However, this is the right size. This is 2 inches by 3.5. And bonus, I basically have my 1/4 inch. So my 1/4 inch line on my ruler falls just at that point. If you can see my point, there's my 1/4 inch line. So it falls right at that line. So if I sew with a scant quarter, which is what I typically sew with, I will be perfectly fine. I will not lose my point. So pressing open did make a difference. So that is one thing you can do to increase your accuracy. Also make sure that when you are sewing your lines, you are sewing to the outside of your drawn lines. You want just a thread or two on that outside. And this, I apologize, this fabric is fraying really bad. But you want to sew to the outside of that line. You do not want to sew right on the line. You want to sew to the outside because that is what the pattern is designed for. That is how a flying geese unit is technically designed to be made. You want to sew to the outside of your drawn line. If you draw with a Sharpie or very thick marker, that might be a little too much of a outside of your line, but you do want to you do want to sew to the outside of your line. So if you are using that diagonal seam tape, you want to make sure that your point is to the inside of the line where you're sewing to the outside of that center line. That will give you that same result. So we're going to take our oversized. And this, again, you don't have to be super accurate. You don't have as many issues. You just have a little bit more trimming. So if you can see this 2-inch line I've got here, I've got room. And this 3.5-inch line, I've got room. So what do you do? Because this is really oversized. This would not fit in the pattern no matter what I did. So I mean, you can see it is way oversized. And a lot of people stop when they get an oversized unit like this because they don't know exactly how to trim it. But I've been doing this for years. I've kind of figured it out. So I know you may not be able to see it on camera super well, but I have my 1/4 inch line on my ruler, and that's 1 inch. That's 2 inches right here. So I'm going to take my 1/4 inch line, and I'm going to do it a thread or two above that mark, and that's how I'm going to trim my width of my flying goose unit, or my height of my unit. I apologize. So I'm going to trim a 1/4 inch away, and then I'm going to flip my unit and trim it to 2 inches. All right, so now our height is correct, but our width is not. That still has not been fixed. So what I'm going to do, so this whole unit is 3.5 inches. So half of 3 is 1.5, add that 1/2 inch. So we're doing a 1 3/4 inch. So that 1 3/4 inch is half of the flying goose unit, what it's supposed to be finished. So I have a 1 3/4 inch marking on my ruler. So I'm going to line that 1 3/4 inch up. I am going to make sure that my bottom side or top side, whichever side you want to trim from, is level with the cuts you've already made, because you know you've got a 1/4 inch seam allowance up at the top of your point, and you're going to line that 1 3/4 inch up, and you are going to trim off the extra, and now your unit will be able to be trimmed at the pattern size. So that is 2 inches by 3.5. And all we had to do was figure out where our center point is and line it up, quite literally, line it up with that little point right there. You don't need a whole lot of extra math to it. You do need to figure out what half of 3.5. So we were supposed to cut this at 3.5. It finishes in the quilt at 1.5 by 3. So if I had cut this following the 1.5 by 3, we would have ended up with our center point at 1.5, which is great and fine, but if we cut all that off, we don't have our seam allowance. So if you look, I've got a 1/4 inch seam allowance right here, and I have my 3 to 3.25 inch seam allowance right here. So at 1.5, where it's supposed to finish, it does. It will in the quilt, because I'm going to be sewing these lines right there. So you've got 4 different options on how you want to do your Flying Geese units. I do not recommend doing the oversized in just one direction. You have to do oversized in both directions. So this is the one that I did according to the pattern, and it matches up perfectly with the one that I did oversized and trimmed down. Now granted, I do have waist. I do. It's an 1/8 of an inch waist by however long, but I don't call it waist because I will put it in a bag. There are ladies in my area that will make it into a bed for a cat or a dog at the shelter, and that is their stuffing. So it's not actually waist, but it's smaller than what I would use. There's really not a good way to sew a piece of fabric that's just an 1/8 of an inch, at least not, you know, the way I would use it. So there's really not that much waste. It's a lot of extra work doing the extra trimming, but you're going to be trimming up anyway, making sure that your pattern sized ones are matching. So the other ones, the other set, again, if you don't add the 1/4 of an inch on the outside edge, I'm not short by a lot. I don't know how much of it you can see. I'm not short by a lot on either outside edge, but I am short. And this piece would be hard to put in the quilt. That one would be hard to sew because I only oversized it one direction. I didn't oversize it both directions. So that is how I do my Flying Geese. And if you would like any other tutorials, feel free to put things in the comments. I do want to give a shout out and a thank you to Katie from Greenland Quilter. She invited me to join her on her New Year's Eve live that was 12 hours. Definitely not something I'm going to do all the time. That is an insane amount of time to be on camera. I did have to step away a few times, but it definitely opened up the door and opened up my mind to being able to do this for you guys. So I know I'm not on camera today, just my mat and my hands, but I will start trying to do some lives here soon. Just give me a few weeks. We're still dealing with some medical for me, and I want to see if I can get to the point where lives are a little bit easier for me to do. Tutorials take a lot more planning for me, whereas a live, I can just answer things on the fly and stop and show in the middle of what I'm working on, and that's a lot easier. I've got 3 projects coming up, and I look forward to sharing them with you guys. Thanks for joining me.